right? They are not adequate to the task. This is where, like, just to give you an example, for me, and this is always concerning to me, and oddly not to anybody else, but you know, like every year they have to change the clock like a microsecond or something so that it keeps up with, do you know what that means? Our sense of time is absolutely wrong, right? It is 100% wrong. Like, it's inaccurate in terms of how the universe functions. Even if it's just a micromillisecond, it means it's absolutely wrong. So now, can we get along and function perfectly well with being wrong? Of course we can. We always have and we will continue to. But it's a little bit fucked up, you know? But that's what the nature of culture, that's what the incest prohibition does, is it indicates a rupture in what has seemed to be a kind of seamless conceptual architecture of nature versus culture. So it's one of those moments, and again, it's only one moment. Incest prohibition is just one thing. But just like that millisecond of time, that one thing shows you that these categories don't work. These categories are not adequate to what you're trying to do. So then the question for Derrida is, okay, Levi-Strauss starts with this. That's cool, right? He starts his discourse with incest taboo. He starts with the limit of nature culture. He's starting with the problem with Western epistemology, or axiology in this case. And that's where he begins. Now, what do you do? So at this point, this is on 284. This example, too cursorily, this is incest, is only one among others, but nevertheless it shows that language bears within itself the necessity of its own critique. Now, this critique may be undertaken along two paths. And he's very Led Zeppelin-y all the time. Like, there are two paths you can go by all the time. Or maybe Robert Frostian.
Let's go with Robert Blake.
Okay. So what can one do once one is at the limit of the nature-culture concept? Well, you can do two things. The first is, once the limit of nature-culture opposition makes itself felt, one might want to question systematically and rigorously the history of these concepts. This is a first action. To concern oneself with the founding concepts of the history of philosophy is not to undertake the work of the philologist or the historian of philosophy. It is probably the most daring way of beginning to step outside of philosophy. The step outside of philosophy is much more difficult to conceive than is generally imagined by those who think they made it with cavalier ease. They were generally swallowed up in metaphysics and the entire body of the discourse. Okay. What he says there is there are two things you can do. The first is deconstruction, which is what I'm doing, right? So a systematic and historic questioning of the conceptual system in which nature and culture operates. That's a first move that one can undertake. And by the way, that questioning of the historical concept is, he thinks, more radical than is often presupposed. The other choice, which I believe corresponds more closely to Levi-Strauss's, is in order to avoid the possibly sterilizing effects of the first one, so this is, if you won't be boring like me, those are always disingenuous. In order to avoid the possibly sterilizing effects of the first one, consists in conserving all these old concepts within the domain of empirical discovery, while here and there denouncing their limits, treating them as tools which can still be used. What does that say?
Do stuff.
It's do stuff. But what does one do? I mean, take the example. What then does Levi-Strauss do? He says, okay, incest prohibition indicates that the nature-culture binary is inadequate, doesn't work well. So, what am I going to do?
He just goes forward and just makes adjustments as he goes.
What are the adjustments?
Admit the problem.
Okay, good. I mean, as a first step, you say, okay, I don't think these things work, right? I don't believe in them anymore, right? This clock thing is clearly wrong, you know? So I'm going to, for instance, denounce its truth value, or at least call into question its truth value, right? But I'm still going to deploy the categories, because how can I not? I'm still going to use nature and culture while not believing in the use of nature and culture.
That's what teachers do all the time in course evaluation.
It's,
We do not believe in them, but we still use them.
it's a belief that one can distinguish, if you want just to be sort of philosophical about it, truth from method. In other words, I will separate out the truth value dimension of this scientific mode of inquiry and retain merely the method. The method, the ways of asking questions. I no longer attach a truth value to it, but it still has a methodological import. It's still a way of asking questions. This is then, he will equate then, and this is the famous term that he will say, then what we are is, we are bricoleurs. What he is attempting to be is a bricoleur. Now what is a bricoleur?
One who builds with whatever they got.
Right. So the bricoleur is building with whatever available tools are at hand. And he's like, well, that's the position we're in, right? We're not in a position, well, we'll forget what we're not for a second. We are in a position where I'm just going to take the tools, and these are the tools of the metaphysical tradition. I don't fucking believe in these tools, and I know that they have certain kind of limits and are problematic, but they're the only things that I have. So I'm going to use them as tools to build my whatever, we'll figure out what that is in just a second. Okay. But in order to make the bricoleur, to distinguish it from anything else, he will distinguish it from what he calls the engineer. What is the engineer? He says, we're all bricoleurs now, we're no longer engineers. Who was the engineer? Bricolage, discourse of method, bricolage is a critical language itself. Okay, well this move is Derrida's, one of Derrida's first critical moves here, is to say, okay, if one calls bricolage, this is on 285, if one calls bricolage the necessity of borrowing one's concepts from the text or heritage of a heritage which is more or less coherent or ruined, then every discourse is bricoleur. The engineer, whom Lévi-Strauss opposes to the bricoleur, should be the one to construct the totality of his own language, syntax, and lexicon.
Solves.
In this sense, the engineer is a myth. A subject who supposedly would be the absolute origin of his own discourse, and supposedly would construct it out of nothing, out of whole cloth, would be the creator of the verb itself. The notion of the engineer who supposedly breaks with all forms of bricolage is therefore a theological idea. The odds are that the engineer is a myth produced by the bricoleur. What's he saying?
Is it like that the notion, the words and ideas and everything must come from a higher being or some central figure or order, but for that to exist, that central order would have to create the languages and ideas that we use, and that's impossible?
Yeah, I mean, effectively, so Lévi-Strauss is saying there's a limit to the way that the concepts function. And I now see that. People before me didn't see that. I now see that nature and culture are concepts that don't work. And so now I'm in this position of like having to work with tools in which I don't believe. So these tools are like sort of ruined tools. Right? Whereas 20 years ago they weren't ruined tools. So because I'm now recognizing that they are ruined tools, I am now bricoleuring. I'm now being a bricoleur. Whereas Derrida is saying everybody has always been a bricoleur because nobody invented their own language. Nobody, like everybody, even the people 20 years ago who didn't recognize that they were using borrowed tools that were borrowed from a broken heritage, were using tools that were borrowed from a broken heritage. In other words, the nature-culture opposition didn't work for them either. So the first suspicion here is like you're inventing this fake idea called the engineer in order to make what you're doing seem better. Right? When in effect, everyone has always been bricoleuring. You know? Does that make sense?
I have a question.
Yeah.
So at what point did we stop where's the origin of bricoleuring?
Brickleluring is all that we've ever been doing. I mean, you're always been, so that the heritage is never something that anyone invents for themselves. No one invents the history of metaphysics. The concepts of presence, man, woman, black, white, no one invents those things. You're always embedded in them from the start. So you're always trafficking in, for instance, the concept of, here we have the concept of nature culture. We have a particular case where in most cases, look, we walk around and use the terms nature culture all the time. Like how many times do you say culture in your class, for God's sake? Like I'm sure a zillion, you know? And it operates perfectly functional, you know? And then here's a moment, this unusual case where you say, ah, it doesn't work. And it points to a limit of the concept of nature and culture. So the question is, once you recognize that these categories don't work well, what do you do? And what he does, what Levi-Strauss chooses to do, is to preserve these things as tools, but not believe in them. And Derrida is sort of saying, well, everyone has always just been using them as tools, whether they believed in them or not. They've still been sort of more or less ruined tools from a more or less heterogeneous heritage. Nobody ever invented language ex nihilo. So this is why, and this thinking is why Levi-Strauss will say that the work he is doing is, the anthropological analysis that he's doing is mythomorphic. What does that mean?
The changing of an overarching idea.
What's that?
The changing of an overarching idea, or the reinvention of
Some form of a myth.
a formative story.
Yeah. In other words, all I'm doing in my analyses of myth is telling more myths. My story has no claim to any transcendent relation to those myths, as most theories would. Right? If you do work on anthropology, you're studying theories, and your explanation pretends to have a transcendent relationship to those explanations. It is translating into the realm of theory and reason and rationality that which is heterogeneous in practice. Right? And what he's saying is no. Now that I'm brickleluring, I like that we can share that. Now that we're engaged, now that we've encountered the limit of our concepts, the decision that he's made as a way of inhabiting the circle is like, okay, I'm going to use these things as tools, but I'm not going to believe in them. And because I don't believe in them, I can't claim for my discourse the status of truth anymore. In fact, I must claim for it the status of myth. And this is exactly one of the things that Derrida has problems with, is to say, he has not rigorously posed the question of the relation between logos and mythos. He is simply absolving himself of having to do that work and just saying, oh, now it's a myth. Which, by the way, no, it's not. Here's how this proceeds. The stuff is all scientific, and it is all organized by the idea that future findings could undermine what it says, could correct it. In other words, the fact that he says it's no longer functioning as truth and it's now myth, that doesn't make it not function as truth. I mean, this is the direction of the whole next 3 pages of the critique, is that despite his claim to be able to distinguish the methodical in mythic studies from the truth value, and to separate them out, and to claim that my things that I'm writing are now myths about myths, and no longer the truth about myths, the discourse continues to function as the truth about myths. It continues to function as a type of a localized empiricism. So basically what he's saying is that Levi-Strauss made a bad choice. No, I mean, that's not true. That's totally unfair, because what he wants to say is, like, look, there are choices for how to inhabit this circle, and that's why you look at Levi-Strauss, because he's a smart dude who recognizes this circle. And again, the circle is the discourse of metaphysics and the discourse of the critique of metaphysics. And you can't give one up without the other, right? You don't get to critique patriarchy without assuming it, by assuming I'm taking it on. And I mean taking it on as both senses of that, which is like fighting it, and assuming and taking it on are the same word, aren't they? So the next couple pages go on to say, you know, basically, the whole question of totalization, its relationship to play, which I won't go into the details of, is to basically say, nevertheless, your discourse, he claims a mythological status, but because he's not rigorously posed the question of the relation between logos and mythos, right, or myth and truth, because he's really not thought through those, what ends up happening is that his discourse functions exactly the same way as the scientific discourse used to function. So that the brick allure thing and the no longer posing as the center doesn't do anything any differently. So that's where we get to at the end. And well, here's the end is the among the most quoted lines in the theory world 20 years ago. So, play must be conceived before the alternative of presence or absence. This is still his critique of Levi-Strauss. So, turn towards the lost or impossible presence of the absent origin. The structuralist thematic of broken immediacy is the saddened, negative, nostalgic, guilty, Rousseauistic side of the thinking of play, whose other side would be the Nietzschean affirmation. Oh, I forgot to wear my Team Nietzsche shirt today. It probably wouldn't be so sweaty. That is the joyous affirmation of the play of the world and of the innocence of becoming. The affirmation of a world of signs without fault, without truth, and without origin, which is offered to an active interpretation. And this is the key element that distinguishes the Nietzschean, what he's going to call the Nietzschean version from the Platonic or Levi-Straussian version. This affirmation then determines the non-center otherwise than as loss of center. So, in other words, Levi-Strauss sees that the center has been lost, which is truth. And he experiences that as a loss. One can experience that not as a loss, right? And we'll read how Nietzsche does that next week, specifically. So it determines the non-center otherwise than as the loss of center, and it plays without security. For there is a sure play, that which is limited to the substitution of a given existing present pieces. In absolute chance, affirmation also surrenders itself, blah, blah, blah. There are thus, okay, now these are the most quoted lines in the theory business. There are thus two interpretations of interpretation, of structure, sign, and play. The one seeks to decipher, dreams of deciphering, a truth or an origin which escapes play and the order of the sign, and which lives the necessity of interpretation as an exile. This is the necessity of interpretation as an alienation from the idea. The other, which is no longer turned towards the origin, affirms play and tries to pass beyond man and humanism, the name of man being the name of that being who, throughout the entire history, has dreamed of full presence and a reassuring foundation, the origin and the end of play. The second interpretation, to which Nietzsche points the way, doesn't seek, as Levi-Strauss does, the inspiration of a new humanism. So, you got Team Plato and Team Nietzsche. Do we understand the difference between Team Plato and Team Nietzsche? Do I understand the difference? You tell me if I do.
The ideal and the shadows versus being this return of the same.
Look, I mean, so this can be thought of as the loss of a signified, by which we mean a loss of a transcendent signified, the loss of a moment at which the movement of signification stops. It's like, oh, those were the days. It was so much nicer when I knew what shit meant. Right? Or you can play with signifiers. That's the difference, right? So that it determines the absence of the center otherwise than as a loss that there's no loss. Right? There is just the movement of signification. There's no moment of pristine presence, idealized presence of the idea to consciousness that has been lost, because that was always a residue of the play of signification. In other words, it may not be so bad to get stuck in a dictionary, Or rather, to be stuck in a dictionary means to do it, to live. It's not all words, there are things too, and that's what you're doing. Constantly proliferating signifiers, images. That can suck. One can look for some way back. One could be nostalgic in Levi-Strauss's sense, which he recognizes there's no way back. There is no truth, but we're not really going to change anything in the course of doing that. So just do the differences between the two discourses make sense? Okay, because this is the really crucial part. Because that part is the part that everybody reads and gets, and they're like, Derrida's on Team Nietzsche, right? Team Plato sucks ass, right? Aren't you all thinking that right now? Like, Team Plato is a bunch of crybabies and nostalgic little fucks, and Team Nietzsche is, well, like, Team Nietzsche beat those guys up at recess, right? No, I guess not. Okay. These two interpretations of interpretation are absolutely irreconcilable, even if we live them simultaneously. Together they share the field which we call the social sciences. For my part, although these two interpretations must acknowledge and accentuate their difference and define their irreducibility, I do not believe that today there is any question of choosing. In the first place, because here we are in a region where the category of choice seems particularly trivial. And in the second, and this is the more interesting, because we must first try to conceive of the common ground of the difference of this irreducible difference. Well, I'll even continue on. Here there is a kind of question, let us still call it historical, whose conception, formation, gestation, and labor we are only catching a glimpse of today. I employ these words, I admit, with a glance towards childbearing, but also with a glance towards those who, in a society from which I don't exclude myself, turn their eyes away when faced by the as yet unnameable which is proclaiming itself and which can do so, as is necessary whenever birth is in the offing, only under the species of the non-species, in the formless, mute, infant, and terrifying form of monstrosity. Why are we talking about monsters? That's some crazy shit, Jack D.
Did you already tell your story about when you first met him?
No, let's not. What's he doing there?
Is he referring to incest again?
No, but I like that. So, although these two interpretations must acknowledge and accentuate their difference, I don't believe there's any question of choosing. In other words, although I've just spent this last half page saying there's Team Plato and there's Team Nietzsche, and it would seem up to this point like he's like Team Nietzsche good, Team Plato losers, he's not saying that. He's saying, I don't believe there's any question of choosing. Why not? Well, first, because the category of choice is this subjective thing, and by the way, this shit just ain't up to you. That's the first reason. But don't worry about that. That's not the reason that interests me for a moment. This is not about a person's individual desire to choose. As we've seen, like the history of metaphysics is much bigger than any of you. So it's your choice. So edit that out. You have to edit the visual fuck yous as well as the verbal. That's going to be tough too. It's like constantly walking around going. Okay. So, all right. So it's not a question of choosing because it's not about the subject. Fine. But why also is not? Why else?
It's not yet.
What's that?
It's future.
Yeah, it's not, I mean, what one must first do is not, I mean, the first project here is to not think of these things as simply different. In other words, you've got to figure out a way of thinking these things, and look, the simple answer is, there are two paths you can go by, lack and force. And by the way, lack's a force. In other words, there's one path you can go by. There are two different styles of going along that one path. And what is the name of that path? The unnameable, the future. Let's take a break.